many migratory birds and fish species. But it's not just the wildlife that this impacts. It impacts people. And this theme around people and nature is really important. So it has impacts around things like exposure to natural hazards, around water scarcity and water quality and food insecurity. The loss of wetlands certainly leads to loss of critical services like clean water and around carbon storage, which is becoming increasingly recognised, the services that wetlands provide around capturing and storing carbon. So I guess some of these messages are not easy messages to communicate, not what we want to hear. But I think I'm very excited to be able to say that Australia's been leading the way around recognising that it's this generation and future generations that really need to step up, and we need to work together to reverse this halt and start to restore wetlands worldwide. And so it's great that this World Wetlands Day, Minister Lee announced that Dylan Jones will be joining us today, is Australia's Ramsar Youth Focal Point. This is the first time a country has adopted a youth focal point internationally, and we're hopeful that this will encourage other countries to follow suit and recognise the need for young people and next generations to really take up this mantle too, and join us in restoring, protecting wetlands. So Dylan will lead on building youth perspectives into wetland policy, and involved in community consultations ahead of our next Conference of Parties, which is scheduled in November later this year in Wuhan, China. So Dylan's been working over the past 5 years with a group of like-minded young professionals and scientists, and they've established a global platform called Youth Engaged in Wetlands. And so I'd really like to acknowledge Dylan and his colleagues, and especially Ariana, who's going to be speaking today as well, for their leadership in the Youth Engaged in Wetlands Forum, and their ongoing work to expand this network of young people engaged in wetland conservation. So this seminar series is just one means of hearing the voices of young people and learning about their research and insights on wetlands. So it's really exciting that we can launch this, and looking forward to what we've got to share today. So I'm going to now pass over to Dylan, and he's going to host the seminar series for the rest of the session.
Cool. Thanks, Michael.
Yay, Dylan! Woo!
Yeah, and thanks, Kathy, and the Australian government actually for picking this up. So hi, I'm Dylan. I have a master's in conservation. I'm really, really worried and intent on improving the way that we deal with the environment. I think wetlands are kind of critically important, both in terms of providing ecosystem services, but also they've kind of borne the brunt of a whole heap of our developments, especially in Australia with a lot of water use and drought. They're not in a good state. And I think it's one of those issues where it's like it's both very important and people don't care about it anywhere near enough. So yeah, I've been involved for a while. Youth Engaged in Wetlands came into being at the Dubai Conference of the Parties a few years ago now. And we're basically creating a global network of young people, PhD students, some people working on restoration projects, some people in government, some activists. And there's like a soft network around that of a lot of other people who've kind of engaged in the flyaway youth forums we've put on, or the side events that we've been a part of at various things like World Water Week or the UNFCCC COP. I guess we are trying to create both like a hub for young people who are working on wetlands to kind of connect with each other and train each other up, but also I guess in this position that the Oz government have put me in, I'm very keen to basically take people's voices and amplify them so that they get heard, perhaps in Ramsar, but also in other policy processes. So if you're here, you're under 35 or so, we're working to create a network of young people in Australia. Please send me an email after this. The plan would be to start getting people together, introduce everyone, and then as we move closer to the Conference of the Parties at the end of the year, take some kind of coherent statement, a set of recommendations, feedback on various processes, anything else, maybe even have people present on their work if we can make that happen. So yeah, please get in touch. I'm very keen to kind of amplify everyone's voices and get everyone in contact with each other. We plan to run monthly or so seminars. I'll get Josh to introduce himself at the end of this, but Josh is on the line. He'll be presenting next time around. We also have some interest from ANU with some people working on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, someone from the University of Adelaide looking at migratory shorebirds. It's going to be a really cool seminar series. I'm really keen to see everyone's work. But first up, we have Ariana. So yeah, Ariana, did you want to introduce yourself or would you like me to?
I'm happy to introduce myself. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Ariana Magini. Currently on Lutruwita country, Palawan people. And I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land in which I currently live and work, including the original custodians of the Kanamalooka or Tamar River wetlands, which are my closest wetlands currently. So I'm currently working here, but my presentation will be about Queensland wetlands. And this is for my dissertation research that I did for my Masters of Climate Change and Environmental Policy. It was through the University of Leeds, but I didn't make it to the UK. So it is still an Australian focus, which I was happy about. And yeah, thanks for having me. Will I get started?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead, please do. Yeah, just kick it off.
Okay, great, thank you. So Dylan's going to be controlling the slides, so I'm just going to be telling him to change them. But I also want to say happy World Wetlands Day to everyone. I'm very excited to be able to present today. It's perfect timing. And so I'll be giving you a quick summary of my master's dissertation research, and that is Intertidal integration. Can climate policy integration facilitate nature-based solutions implementation, such as coastal wetlands restoration in Australia? I did also want to flag that my research was conducted prior to the release of the new blue carbon emissions reduction funds and methods. So please keep that in mind when I discuss it. I'm yet to update my findings with that new policy, but I do hope to do that. All right, next slide, please, Dylan. All right, so I'm sure you guys are aware about this general introduction, but I will present the background. So there's mounting evidence that nature-based solutions, which if it's all right, I'm going to use the acronyms. So NBS, nature-based solutions, can achieve synergies for climate change objectives through the conservation and restoration of ecosystems by harnessing their provision of ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration for climate change mitigation and protection from climate hazards, also known commonly as ecosystem-based adaptation, or EBA. So literature review reveals that while the implementation of nature-based solutions is growing globally, particularly in developing countries where local communities' livelihoods are closely linked with the land, implementation has been somewhat limited in developed countries, including Australia, within our policies. So that's a little snapshot diagram of how they're all interrelated concepts, because sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they all are interrelated. Okay, next slide, please, Dylan. So NBS have immense potential in Australia, given the country's abundance of natural areas providing valuable ecosystem services. And among the many examples of nature-based solutions, mangroves and coastal wetlands have been championed as a priority nature-based solution for climate change mitigation, termed blue carbon. And there's a great diagram of blue carbon here from the latest ERF methods. as well as adaptation, given that they are one of the richest sources of ecosystem services globally, offering a range of provisioning, regulating, cultural and supporting services. So coastal wetlands cover a large area of Australian coastlines, including the third largest proportion of mangroves globally, which is interesting, behind Indonesia and Brazil. Other studies have found that existing coastal management approaches and policies in Australia do not adequately value the ecosystem services of these coastal wetlands, and population growth and developments threatens their continued decline, reducing their ability to protect communities against the impacts of climate change. This is alarming given that majority of the Australian population live along the coastline, and increasing ecosystem-based adaptation could be particularly beneficial in Australia, where our coastal communities are exposed to high climate variability, and marine and coastal ecosystems also play in our tourism jobs, recreation activities and fisheries. Furthermore, adaptation of coastal communities has been extremely slow-paced, with very few specific adaptation measures being implemented at this stage, therefore presenting an opportunity for the implementation of innovative interventions such as nature-based solution. Next slide, please. So there are calls within the literature urging the need for a more integrated approach to coastal management in Australia, including mitigation and adaptation to climate change, sustainable development, a systems-based approach to coastal processes, and consideration of both marine and terrestrial environments. An approach that may pose a solution is climate policy integration, also known as, I'll refer as CPI. So CPI is the coordination of climate change objectives within and across sectors, has increasingly become recognised as integral to policy making. CPI is commonly interpreted as the integration of either mitigation or adaptation objectives across sectoral policies, and that's been the focus of research, most research including in Australia. Fewer studies have considered the integration of both mitigation and adaptation climate objectives together. And the research gap is particularly apparent in Australia, with only a few examples of studies analysing the integration of adaptation and mitigation actions. De Gregor et al. 2017 was the first to reconceptualize CPI by explicitly considering the interactions between mitigation and adaptation, identifying the synergies or co-benefits and trade-offs of policies in land use sector in Indonesia. So they defined CPI as the integration of multiple policy objectives, governance arrangements and policy processes related to climate change, mitigation, adaptation and other policy domains, and asserted that applying CPI when developing climate change policies can avoid incoherence in policy design and lead to more effective outcomes. And the integration of mitigation and adaptation can be justified by the fact that mitigation and adaptation are inherently linked, because the ability of our socio-ecological systems to adapt to climate change depends on the level of mitigation that we achieve, and therefore the severity of those impacts. So while CPI is difficult and transformational endeavour, avenues of execution can be identified when considering smaller scales, such as a specific policy sector. Next slide, please. So CPI in the wetlands policy sector presents the opportunity to bring policy in line with the latest science, potentially facilitating the implementation of nature-based solutions that can achieve synergies with mitigation and adaptation climate objectives, as well as biodiversity protection. However, no recent studies have examined the existence or need for CPI within mangrove and coastal wetlands policies that explicitly integrates both mitigation and adaptation objectives. So the broad aim of this study was to explore the extent to which existing local, state, national and international wetlands policy related to mangroves and coastal wetlands in Queensland is coherent with climate change objectives and whether enhanced CPI could support wider nature-based solutions implementation with mangrove and coastal wetlands restoration in the future. Next slide, please. So in order to achieve this aim, the study asked the following research questions: to what extent are mangroves and coastal wetland policies coherent with climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives, and how? And could enhanced CPI in the wetlands policy sector support increased nature-based solutions implementation in the future? And the study uses the Australian state of Queensland as a case study to assess these questions with the following objectives: using existing analytical frameworks to analyse wetlands policy documents for internal and external policy coherence, including how mitigation and adaptation objectives are integrated. I conducted semi-structured interviews to explore the perspectives of policymakers and wetlands experts. I'll explain this further in the next few slides, and I do a policy analysis. Next slide, please. I explain that further in the next ones. Excuse me. So, this study employs the De Gregory et al. Revised CPI analytical framework, in which policy integration is separated into horizontal and vertical administrative dimensions. And so horizontal CPI refers to the institutional interactions across different sectors of the policy domains, usually within one level of government, and whether a comprehensive cross-sectorial strategy has been developed. So this diagram shows the different horizontal and vertical dimensions, and in the boxes I give the relevance to wetlands. Vertical policy integration refers to the extent to which a specific sector or policy domain has adopted and sought to merge climate change objective into its sectorial objectives across multiple levels of government. And De Gregory et al. Further separated vertical policy integration into internal and external policy coherence. So here policy coherence refers to policy output and outcomes, or the consistency of multiple policy objectives and associated implementation arrangements. Internal policy coherence comprises integrating climate change mitigation and adaptation into climate policy, so increasing synergies and co-benefits and reducing negative trade-offs, whereas external policy coherence refers to climate change, mainstreaming climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives into a broader non-climate policy. This study focuses on the vertical CPI only, which is shaded, and the vertical policy domain identified for this analysis is a subset of landscape management that will be referred to as wetlands policy sector, to focus the analysis on policies relevant to mangroves and coastal wetlands in Queensland. So another study extrapolated the above framework by dividing internal policy coherence into three distinct models to analyse how climate objectives are integrated, and they did it for the Canadian forest policy. Next slide, please. So these are the three models adapted to the wetlands policy sector. So the first separation model is the consideration of mitigation and adaptation as two independent objectives that are treated separately, and that's the most common model used in the literature. In the second interaction model, both climate change objectives are considered simultaneously during the design and implementation of policies, either positively with synergies or negatively with trade-offs. And the third adaptation first model introduces a new approach to CPI that considers that practical reality that adaptation is an intrinsic and crucial component that ensures the persistence of the provision of all ecosystem services under climate change, which ultimately allows for mitigation. So it is considered a necessary means to accomplish mitigation. So this study hypothesized that taking the approach of CPI according to the interaction model may facilitate opportunities for the wider implementation of nature-based solutions that emphasize synergistic outcomes for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this is critical given that the immense potential of nature-based solutions, but the lack of systematic implementation. So the literature suggests that more frameworks are required that capture the provision of multiple benefits of nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So just a quick snapshot of the methodology. So firstly, policy documents were chosen for their direct relevance to mangroves and coastal wetlands in Queensland. This includes local, state, national and international policies that apply to the wetlands, including strategies, regulatory documents and statutory documents. In total, 38 policy documents were analysed and they were coded using a combination of deductive and inductive methodology. And an initial list of categories was identified in advance based on those two analytical frameworks I just outlined, as well as relevant concepts identified within the literature. Secondly, qualitative semi-structured interviews were conducted with a sample of 10 key stakeholders directly involved in the wetlands policy process, including policymakers and wetlands experts from local and state governments and academia. So the purpose of the interviews were to gain an in-depth and more nuanced understanding of the views of the policymakers and wetlands experts about climate policy integration in the wetlands policy sector and the realities of the governance structures, the policy process and practical nature-based solution implementation. All right, next slide, please. So here's a quick snapshot of the results. The results just generally indicated limited policy coherence of climate objectives. This table is a short summary of results with the type of policy coherence, internal or external listed, and the primary model used for integration of adaptation and mitigation. So the blanks are if there was no climate policy integration or policy coherence. In summary, despite half of the non-climate policy documents integrating climate objectives and some climate policy documents integrating both mitigation and adaptation, most policies continue to primarily employ the separation model, i.e. adaptation only policy instead of the interaction model or integration of both mitigation and adaptation. So I'm going to explain these results a bit more thoroughly in the next slide. So next slide, please. So regarding external climate policy coherence, and a reminder of what that is, it's a description in the top right. Of the 28 non-climate policy documents analysed, half did not refer to climate change directly or indirectly, and therefore do not exhibit external policy coherence. So that they were the blanks in the table. And of the 14 non-climate policy documents that did demonstrate external climate policy, 8 used the separation model and 5 used the interaction model. So of the separation model, adaptation was the most common climate objective. And a key example of policy coherence and interaction model is in the policy called Australia's Strategy for Nature, 2019 to 2030. There's an image of it there, which has integrated both the AHE biodiversity targets and sustainability development goals to align with its own objectives. And it demonstrates pretty strong integration in its wording and whatnot. So just an example of a paragraph there is strategies that will both minimize the impact of and promote adaptation to change are needed. Efforts to reduce the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere will need to include protection of natural ecosystems, especially primary forest wetlands and peatlands, and recovery of carbon stores through revegetation. Building resilience will be key to helping natural systems retain their capacity to adapt to shifting climatic conditions. So it's an example of good wording that demonstrates that integration that we're looking for. Next slide, please. So several interviewees identified the Wetlands of the Great Barrier Reef Catchments Management Strategy 2016 to 2021, so due for a new one, policy as a key example of effective policy coherence. And this was also demonstrated in the document analysis. So integration is a key theme throughout the document, with the key message stating that the strategy promotes an integrated approach to the catchment management that considers the multiple values of wetlands and in a whole of catchment context, before going on to list several mitigation and adaptation values. Objective 1, for example, Objective 1.13 says tools are available to mitigate the impacts of climate change on wetlands, and it includes the current and proposed activities of updated tools to integrate wetlands and climate change in the context of resource planning, management and ecosystem repair to enable effective site-based wetland decisions. So that's another example of where it is at least demonstrating the correct wording in the policies, and the interviewees also identified it as showing that policy coherence. Next slide, please. So regarding internal climate policy coherence, again, the definition is at the right. Majority of the climate policy documents employed the separation model, and adaptation was the most common climate objective. So, and that supported the interviewees' claim that mitigation has been a lot slower to get into policy. Only 2 of 12 climate policy documents exhibited internal climate policy coherence by including both mitigation and adaptation of climate objectives in a way that consistently demonstrated the interaction model. So those are the 2 listed here, snapshot from the table. The International UNESCO Strategy for Action on Climate Change and the Queensland Land Restoration Fund. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'll just highlight the Queensland Land Restoration Fund, which is arguably Queensland's most integrated policy when it comes to CPI and policy coherence. So despite being a mitigation-focused payments for ecosystem services scheme, the policy also prioritises adaptation. The co-benefits standard policy document advises that project proponents should consider how the project may contribute to climate adaptation and community resilience to climate change impacts, such as drought or heat waves, as well as how climate change will impact the feasibility of the activity. And the policy is also unique in promoting the provision of nature-based climate adaptation outcomes. The interviewees also praised the LRF as alternate for its novel and proactive model of having co-benefits specifically embedded in it and higher premiums for activities that have more co-benefits. So in other words, where the wholes are a lot more than the sum of its individual parts. And interviewee 4 claimed that that's how we're going to get any real policy traction on protecting and restoring wetlands, is by having those synergies well recognised. Next slide, please. Regarding the CPI models, of the 25 documents that referred to mitigation and adaptation climate objectives, the majority, 18, used the separation model, and 7 consistently used the interaction model. So some mentioned both, but only 7 of them consistently used the interaction model. The 7 documents that used the interaction model were published between 2008 and 2020. So there's no obvious temporal trend of a transition away from the separation model and towards the interaction model over time, as the previous study had shown. But despite this finding in the policy analysis, most interviewees were adamant about increasing CPI in recent years, and I'll go into that further later. But no documents employed the type of language or approach of the adaptation first model, even though the focus was on adaptation. They didn't speak of it as a need to adapt to ensure mitigation. Next slide, please. So results from the interviews highlighted 5 themes of barriers believed to prevent effective CPI and wider nature-based solutions implementation generally. I'll be going through some of those. So despite the positives of the Land Restoration Fund, some interviewees pointed out that the scheme's application is limited in scope, including the absence of payment for adaptation ecosystem services such as flood mitigation. There are currently only payments for carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and water quality. So interviewees also identified the spatial limitations of the LRF. For example, the initial investment rounds are available to a limited number of voluntary projects that meet limiting criteria, and meaning that the broad-scale implementation of nature-based solutions that is required will not be achieved through the LRF. Of the limiting criteria is the requirement of project additionality, meaning that projects only receive benefits if the restoration wouldn't otherwise have taken place. So I'm sure lots of you know additionality is a difficult criteria used to achieve productivity and balance, but it excludes passive restoration or previous restoration. So the additionality criterion also creates a trade-off for some blue carbon species that have existing protections, such as mangroves in Queensland. However, this only considers current spatial extent from a recent baseline and under current climatic conditions. So that can be complicated. Despite several interviewees pointing out the need for assisted migration of coastal wetlands to adapt to climate change, so considering future climatic conditions. Others addressed the issue of competing objectives such as coastal squeeze, which this nice diagram from the Global Wetlands Project shows, which is coastal squeeze of endangered salt marsh communities between migrating mangroves and, on the other side, sought after agricultural land or development in the way of migration. Next slide, please. In the other barriers, the integration of climate change and nature-based solutions considerations into coastal legislation is largely absent. Queensland Government Coastal Plan used to have a mandated sea level rise and climate change hazard accommodations and stringent restrictions on development in at-risk coastal areas, but these regulations were removed in 2012, which is issue. It hasn't been reversed. Another legislative barrier to the blue carbon method, again prior to it coming out, is the ambiguity of the intertidal zone, with existing legislation separating the marine and terrestrial boundaries. But please note that this has been included in the new blue carbon methods somewhat, so that's good. And most interviewees highlighted that the main barriers are socioeconomic, and changing mindsets is needed to facilitate changing practices. So interviewees highlighted that the need to overcome conservative mindsets and behaviour when it comes to coastal management, particularly the use of hard engineering coastal defences such as seawalls. And this often requires in situ trials of novel approaches for them to be adopted, including early adopters or pioneers of the program that can facilitate that. So financial incentives were also highlighted as crucial to changing some mindsets, and advocated for payments for ecosystem services such as the blue carbon methods, and that can be a window of opportunity for CPI and nature-based solutions implementation. They also added that regarding financial incentives, adaptation is probably lagging further behind mitigation. Finally, some interviewers indicated that governance structures also pose barriers to climate policy integration. For example, the difficulty of collaborating on all aspects of wetlands policy within existing governance structures, as well as the challenges associated with developing a set of agreed indicators or targets for measuring the contribution that a whole range of programs and projects are making to those targets. It's quite challenging. However, the interviewers did highlight that efforts are being made to change this, including the example of the latest blue carbon ERF methods that employed quite collaborative and co-designed workshops and meetings for probably the first time that they believe that's occurred quite thoroughly, including with traditional First Nations groups also involved, with the example of, next slide please, the Blue Heart pilot program. So Gubbi Gubbi Nations people were also included in the setup of this program. So fortunately, 2 interviewees indicated that there is likely to be additional methods developed in the future that may cater to aspects that are excluded in the blue carbon methods, such as payments of coastal protection, fingers crossed. Therefore, the blue carbon methods are paving the way for climate policy integration, facilitating nature-based solutions implementation. One interviewee stated that the Blue Heart Carbon project, which you can see behind me and on the screen, demonstrates what can be achieved and potentially the adjustments that have to be made to policy to help this be applied further. Next slide, please. So just a quick summary of the discussion and conclusion. So the half of the documents that did not refer to climate change are out of touch with the reality that climate change affects all policy areas. And as the interviewees acknowledged, this is a significant barrier to nature-based solutions implementation. It is an imperative that these policies be updated to not only recognise climate change impacts, but also the relevance of the policies to mitigation and adaptation targets. So keeping up their contribution to those targets and the reduction of trade-offs with these targets. The document analysis also revealed that the climate policy documents are overwhelmingly lacking internal policy coherence, and adaptation remains the primary focus of most policies, with only brief mentions of mitigation included in some documents. This result is shared with other studies and indicates a broader issue that adaptation policies, most of which have been published in the last 4 years have not adopted the recommendations made by experts several years earlier concerning the need for adaptation strategies to consider mitigation, climate policies and objectives. The document analysis finding appears to suggest that mangroves and coastal wetlands policies are mostly incoherent with climate change objectives. However, insights from the interviews provided information that suggested otherwise, including increasing climate policy integration in governance structures and the policy-making process. As I mentioned, collaborative efforts and co-design efforts. Furthermore, the interview responses demonstrate that the policymakers and wetlands experts agree with the synergies between mitigation and adaptation objectives for mangroves and coastal wetlands, i.e. the interaction model. However, many of their responses indicated their preference for the adaptation first model due to their recognition for the need to prioritise adaptation to prevent the inundation and loss of mangroves and coastal wetlands from sea level rise. So that's, again, supporting the assisted migration as the sea levels rise. This result could challenge assumptions about the benefits of the interaction model and compels further research into whether this is a more appropriate approach as we near to climate change tipping points and certainties. And so adaptation becomes the prioritised strategies and a higher priority. Ultimately, despite lower levels of climate policy integration than what is desired, with the key examples of the Land Restoration Fund and a few other policies, the results demonstrated that climate policy integration can support nature-based solutions implementation in Queensland, and this should be pursued in future wetlands policy making. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ari. That was really interesting. There was a lot in there. I really hope that this can kind of get written up at some point and shared, because I think there's value to a lot of the people on the line from some of that analysis. I was really impressed. There was a lot there though. So I think we'll take a bit of time now for some questions if anyone has any. I had a couple to kick off with, which are just coming from where I'm sitting. The first one would be, say, hypothetically, if you were developing management strategies for an individual wetland or a Ramsar site, something along these lines, what would be, in your opinion, the best way to incorporate adaptation and mitigation into the management plan or some of the other documents that would go around that?
Yeah, so it's just making sure that we are highlighting all of their ecosystem services, not just focusing on the carbon that they provide, but also recognising that they are preventing flooding and whatnot. So lots of, when I referred to a lot of the adaptation only documents, it's a lot of the coastal hazard adaptation strategies, and they are referring to the wetlands only as adaptation, not considering also the mitigation options. So if you're making a management strategy, you just need to consider all values at once and make sure it's comprehensive in it. And there's what's that term? The sum is greater than the parts. Yeah.
Yep. Did anyone have any questions? Yes. Can you hear her?
I can't hear anything.
Yep, now.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Ariana. Janine Cullen here, Director Wetlands. I was really impressed by the conceptual basis of what you were talking about. From our lived experience in implementing the Ramsar side of the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, there's a real disjunct between climate change mitigation and climate change and biodiversity conservation, adaptation, resilience. Most of the things that come across my desk include major energy projects in protected areas, offshore wind against Ramsar sites, so-called renewable energy hubs, which is another word for ammonia production, right smack bang in Ramsar sites. So the lack of integration is a really important issue that I think needs actually to be discussed. Not all renewable energy projects are in fact good renewable energy projects, but my question comes to a policy that has been floating around for a while in the EPB space, and that's the issue of a climate trigger. And traditionally that climate trigger has been seen as a mitigation. So if you build a coal mine, you know, it has to be assessed under the EPBC because of its emissions. But I'm wondering what's your thoughts of actually broadening that concept of climate trigger to include adaptation, where a particular development actually leads to a loss of the adaptation potential of the environment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So referring back to even the renewable energy opportunities, where mitigation is the focus, but if they're going to impact on the coastal wetlands, you also need to factor that the mitigation potential is being lost from those wetlands if they're going to have reduced area from any damage from the development, as well as reduced adaptation and biodiversity areas potential. So we need to be, you know, being smart about weighing up the benefits of a renewable energy or any sort of development that is aimed at improving mitigation compared to our wetlands that can potentially offer more benefits, so that they should be given higher value for the benefits, the additional benefits that they can provide, and the fact that they have those synergies with mitigation, adaptation, and biodiversity protection, as well as, you know, tourism jobs and blah, should make them way higher in the cost benefit analysis. So yeah, we need to be giving them more recognition for those synergies, in my opinion. So yeah, if that climate trigger, it should be not just mitigation, but the adaptation potential. The several climate objectives should be in the trigger.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You can't just reduce everything to little simple triggers that ignore that kind of thing. So Jimmy Bolzer has his hand up. Jimmy, do you want to say your question?
Yeah, no, fantastic presentation. And I think I just want to ask, because the OECD, they have a really great policy coherence for sustainable development team. They have a really strong focus on that, which pertains really well to what you've written about here. Have you ever thought of going to the OECD and actually pitching your idea to them and actually influencing some of their policy?
No, I haven't, but thanks for the suggestion. I didn't know about their policy integration aspects, so I'll definitely look into that.
Oh, good. If you just type in OECD policy coherence for sustainable development, like there's a whole bunch of resources available, and they've written a lot about it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Something for the youth engaged in Wetlands Network, Ariana and Dylan.
Okay.
People here are saying that we now have a new head of the OECD who apparently cares a lot about climate change. We can.
To hear that.
I think it would be worth actually us getting in contact with them. So I think let's do it.
Good tip, Jimmy. Thanks.
Thanks, Jimmy.
From Launceston to Brussels.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts, any ideas, any random queries of Ari? If no one does, I'm just wondering. Oh, yep, someone's got their hand. Esther.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. I got a lot out of it. It was awesome. This is a bit random, but I'm in the environmental economic accounting team. So I was wondering if you came across environmental economic accounting as part of this, as a way of making a case for climate policy integration, as a way of, I suppose, measuring it.
Yeah. No, I didn't look into that aspect, but we could have a chat after, and if you see potential for that, that would be great.
Yeah, I can get in touch with you through the Wetlands team. I actually have to go to another meeting, so.
Okay, we'll talk later.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks, Jason. Well, it is the end of the hour. Oh, Erin, you've got a question? What was your question?
That's okay. I can just email Ari to ask her. That's all good.
Okay. Yeah, I think I will wrap it up because people are starting to head off to their times. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming and for putting up with our tech hurdles at first, still just making sure everything works. I thought this went really well. Thank you so much, Ari. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I will just hand the floor to Josh briefly because he's going to talk to us about next month's presentation, which will be on the 2nd of March, and you'll receive an email. Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan, and thanks for organising it. Ari, that was a great presentation, and I think as someone who's more into kind of the biological research area, we need people to kind of help us integrate that into policies, and so yeah, it was really good, and I'm glad kind of I have someone that I can contact that is an expert in that area. So I'm sure you get some emails in future from me. My talk on the 2nd of March will look into how we can use drones to help us survey and manage wetlands and monitor the ecosystem. So looking at if we need policies around drone use in wetlands, because drones potentially cause disturbance to birds and other wildlife that use the wetlands, but also looking at what tools we can develop to enable researchers to easily go out and survey these wetland areas with drones and process that data quickly, because it can end up being thousands of images containing tens of thousands of birds. So yeah, developing conservation tools to help us monitor wetland areas with drones.
Yeah, it's hard to identify shorebirds as a human, but hopefully machines can kind of learn to do it quite quickly. I'm keen for this, so that'll be next month on the 2nd of March, and we've got kind of a whole set of talks lined up throughout the year. Please contact the Wetlands team here at DOOR if you want to get in touch with the speakers or any of us or have any further thoughts or ideas. And please also contact me if you're young and keen on wetlands. And if it would be, sorry, I don't know. But it would be great for people to meet up and to discuss what we can do over the course of the year. I think it'd be good to kind of get youth voices. Maybe we can go to the OECD. Maybe we can go to the COP. It'd be good to kind of get people's thoughts together, and I don't know. I think it'd be good for all of us as well. Otherwise, everyone, thank you for coming. Have a really nice day.
The revolution's begun. Woohoo!
All right, I'm going to end the meeting now. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Dylan.
Sorry, I'm a bit nervous.
Thank you.